We're recording.
Yes, great.
Ken Simonson.
All right. Well, thank you, David. Thank you, folks in virtual land and here in the room. It's a pleasure to be back here in Arizona, and thank you for getting the temperature down below the triple-digit level. Let me see if I'm able to share my screen here and put it on presenter style. All right. I want to start by talking about the employment situation, move to what's going on with costs, and then a little bit about where I think construction is headed. Construction, like the overall economy, was really slammed hard by the recession, by the pandemic hitting in February of 2020. The slide here breaks construction into two pieces. Residential construction consists of home builders and multifamily general contractors, plus specialty trade contractors, whether they're working on new homes or additions and renovations to existing homes. The non-residential side includes heavy and civil engineering construction firms, non-residential building contractors, and specialty trade contractors who did primarily non-residential work. And you can see both of those lines plunged at the same rate as overall non-farm payroll employment, the headline figure you hear about on the first Friday of each month.
Let me see if I can move this up for you real quick. Let me see if I can move this. I think I can move that up. Move that up to there.
Residential employment then started booming as soon as people realized that they needed to either add to or remodel their home or get into a house, or they had the opportunity to move to a state like Arizona instead of being stuck in a higher cost, higher congestion area. And that has continued right up through last month. The figures that came out last Friday still showed an increase in residential construction employment, even though home building is starting to descend and I think is really going to plunge. Yesterday, we learned that the 30-year fixed mortgage rate got to the highest level since 1982. It's now 6.92%. And so I think there's going to be a lot less home building going forward. Non-residential construction also rebounded in May of 2020 when projects that have been stopped by government order or owners' nervousness were able to resume. But then you can see that employment level flattened out for 14 straight months until August of 2021. Since then, it's been climbing at more or less the same rate as the overall economy and residential construction, but it's still well below where it was in February of 2020. A major reason for that is that there just aren't any qualified workers out there. Well, I shouldn't say aren't any, but there certainly aren't enough. The number of job openings at the end of August, represented by this blue line, was by far the highest August total in the 22-year history of this series called Job Openings and Labor Turnover Survey, or JOLTS. Meanwhile, the red line shows that the number of people hired in August this year was quite consistent with what we've seen for several years, and it actually fell short of the number of openings at the end of the month, implying that contractors wanted to hire twice as many people as they were able to bring on board. Why is it so difficult? They just aren't out there. This figure tracks the unemployment rate among people who have construction experience, said that they didn't work for pay at all in the previous 4 weeks and were actively looking for work. And it was down below 4%, just about as low as for the overall economy. The September numbers that came out last Friday, even lower, 3.3%, the lowest yet for construction unemployment in September. Well, the picture does vary a lot by state. This shows that in the last 12 months up through August, 43 states did add jobs, and Arizona added quite a strong clip. For the US as a whole, a 4% increase in jobs in construction. Here in Arizona, 5.5%. But we also know that you have a heck of a lot of projects going on or teed up waiting to happen as soon as contractors say, okay, I have the staffing available to do that. Let me switch to what's going on with costs. This shows two series from the Producer Price Index that came out on Wednesday. And in fact, we do now have a September figure. So the red line is called the Producer Price Index for inputs to new non-residential construction. And this is a weighted average of all of the materials and some services, such as trucking and design services, used in non-residential construction. The blue line is what I call a bid price index. The formal name is the Producer Price Index for new non-residential building construction. Unfortunately, BLS doesn't produce a similar index for highway or other horizontal construction, but it still, I think, gives a reasonable idea of what's been going on. Back in September 2020, both indexes were rising at a very modest 1.8% year-over-year rate. Now that has increased, or after that, the input cost index just took off as so many materials jumped in price, often to record levels, as in the case of steel and lumber, copper, and a number of others. By the June of 2021, that index was rising at a 24% year-over-year rate, and it stayed at or above that 20% line for 12 straight months. Meanwhile, the bid price index stayed very modest for several months, and then in 2021, it did begin climbing. In the last few months, it's actually gone up more than the input price index, as steel, lumber, for a while, diesel fuel were coming down very sharply, and so that red line is no longer rising as fast. But even with the September reading, 12.6%, or here you see the August number, 13% year-over-year change, that's a lot higher than the consumer price index. That figure came out yesterday, 8.2%. Certainly very high, a lot more than wages. People are falling behind. But construction, it's been a much tougher story. And of course, contractors have to live with their bids. So that entire period, that entire area in which the red line exceeds the blue represents times that contractors were underwater in terms of not covering the materials cost through their bid prices. Here are some of the things that have contributed to that huge run up in the red line. Steel mill products from April of 2020, the low point of economic activity, up through August, more than doubled, up 103%. And that was in spite of declines late last year and in the last few months. Plastic construction products, the green line, up almost 60% and still climbing. Copper and brass mill shapes, lumber and plywood, gypsum building materials, all up roughly 50%. And then truck transportation up by 36%. Now, what's not here is a couple of the things that you are buying or selling, concrete, cement, asphalt. Those have not gone up as much, but they have also been going up much more than they historically have been. And from what I've been hearing from your state, as well as from across the Southeast, and more recently from Chicago and Milwaukee, that cement is now on allocation, or the ready mix companies are putting their contracting customers on allocation. Unfortunately, I think that situation is likely to get worse. We have not been building new cement capacity in this country for well over a decade. And with the environmental rules and the NIMBYism, we're not likely to see approval of new cement plants. With the greater emphasis on reducing the carbon footprint of cement, switching to limestone Portland cement, we're likely to see areas where that transition is not going smoothly. And again, we're going to be having even greater shortages or tighter allocation. It's not just cement, though. To get a highway up and functioning, you need electrical connections, and the lead time for transformers is stretched out beyond 2 years in some cases. Local utilities, particularly municipal ones, have been cutting off customers who want new transformers to hook up the new buildings, because transformer supply is so limited that they're holding on to what they have for emergency replacements and not allowing new connections. And switchgear also dramatic increase in lead times. So I do think that we're going to continue to have supply chain problems, even as some things do improve. Well, I don't have a crystal ball, but I have a rear view mirror, and that's the view that you see here. This shows the periods in which that year-over-year change in input costs was exceeding the year-over-year change in bid prices. It lasted as long as 26 months at the end of 2009, and again for more than 2 years, starting in October of 2016. This time it lasted for 19 months. It reversed at the end. You can see that stalactite pointing down sharply, but you can see also below the zero line that there are extremely variable periods in which the contractors were catching up, if you will, when their bid prices were rising faster than the materials costs, or the bid prices were continuing to hold or rise while the materials costs declined, or they both declined, but the bid prices didn't fall as fast. So it's really impossible to predict based on historical data how big the gap gets, how long it will last. Here's a look at what's been going on in construction spending on projects underway, or what the census calls value put in place. Some of you may be familiar with figures from Dodge Construction Network or Construct Connect. They are putting the entire value of a project into their press release the month that they deem it to have started. Census instead is measuring the spending on projects month by month as they take place. They're both valid ways of looking at what's going on. The Dodge and Construct Connect numbers are a leading indicator, and this is what we call a coincident indicator. It goes directly into gross domestic product estimate. All of them suffer from the drawback that they are only measuring current dollar spending. They're not adjusted for inflation. We don't have a single deflator that works for highways and hotels, hospitals, and so forth. At any rate, you can see that total spending was up 9%, but we don't know how much of that is new lane miles or square footage or housing units, and how much is just price increase. The rest of the table is organized in descending order of August 2022 spending. Highway and street construction was the third biggest category. It is positive, it's in the black, but remember with the inflation adjustment, a 2% increase may not represent actual number of projects or length and size of projects. It's a combination of that price increase and number. Another category that some of you are involved with, farther down the list, transportation. It's in the red, meaning it's down, but just 0.4%. And big differences within the categories. At the moment, airport construction down a lot. I know you still have things going on here at Phoenix, but probably not at the same intensity that you had a year or 2 years ago. And similarly around the country, it varies. There's still a lot happening at LAX, at the New York airports, but some other projects have wrapped up. Nevertheless, I think the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act is going to add greatly to the money that you'll have available for projects once we work through, or I should say the federal agencies responsible for them, work through the new requirements on Build America, Buy America, and labor requirements and so forth. So that is clearly taking quite a while. And while I think an upturn is sure, the timing is not. We have some forward-looking indicators for building construction. I'm going to skip over these since I think you guys are mostly more interested in the horizontal and we don't have anything comparable there. But let me summarize where I think we're going. Now, I admit that I'm an eternal optimist. So when I say I don't think we're going into recession, keep that in mind. But We do see that consumers still have a lot of spending power, even though it's being eroded by high prices at the moment. Wages are going up much more than they have been for about 20 years, and that includes construction wages. So I think consumers will still be able to buy a lot of stuff. They're not going to be buying homes or the things that go into them. So some sectors are certainly going to be hurt. Businesses, we're getting mixed reports about profits in the latest quarter, and certainly some firms are being hit hard. For instance, firms that rely on exports with the very strong dollar. It's great for those of us who travel abroad or who are importing things, but it's very tough on an exporter, particularly as Europe seems to be heading into a fairly harsh recession. Other parts of the world are certainly struggling. Governments, the state governments have been doing phenomenally well, both on their own revenue increases and on the many rounds of funding for various packages from the federal government. And so I do expect that consumers, businesses, and government will all continue to spend at a level that is going to keep the economy out of recession and will keep employment rising. In addition, construction stands to gain a lot. We talked about the IIJA money coming out in pretty much starting next year and continuing for several years. But also we now have the CHIPS and Science Act, which has given Intel a big boost, TSMC, Samsung. I know you've already been benefiting from what Intel and TSMC have been investing, but I think there's much more to come thanks to that act. And it will be a big chunk of that will be right here in the Valley of the Sun. And then most recently, the Inflation Reduction Act puts in place for 10 years instead of 1 year at a time those tax credits for solar and wind, and now new tax credits for things like utility scale battery storage and for carbon capture. So a lot will be happening for horizontal and heavy construction. For the longer term, I think finding materials is going to be the biggest challenge. I think it's really unfortunate how policy has shifted away from encouraging people to come here to get an education and to provide their working skills. And I think that that's going to cost us in terms of economic growth, as well as in demand for construction of housing, of local streets, underground utilities. It's also going to slow the growth of universities like ASU that have attracted large numbers of foreign students, many of whom now cannot get a visa or are worried that once they do get their degree, they won't be able to stay in the country. The shift from retail to e-commerce continues and means new types of e-commerce structures will be coming along. Healthcare will be evolving away from hospitals and to more specialized standalone and diagnostic and testing facilities. And then continued strong growth in alternative energy projects. Here's how population changed a year ago. We won't get the July 2022 estimates until December, but I think Arizona is likely to remain bright green, not thanks to a lot of rainfall, but to a lot of population falling into the state from California, certainly, but also from many other states north and east of you. In fact, the entire Intermountain West is the fastest growing region of the country, and I think that will continue to remain the case for years to come, with additional growth happening across Texas and the Southeast, and declining or flat population as shown by the 17 states in deep red that had declines last year. That was a record number, and all of those states in pink that had growth of less than 0.5%. So I'll leave it there. I'd be glad to take questions now. And as David said, you're welcome to sign up for the Data Digest, my one-page weekly email at ken.simonson@agc.org. Email me there and I'll be glad to send along a full set of these slides and also the latest edition of the Construction Inflation Alert. That's an 8-page document that lays out what's been going on with materials costs, supply chain issues, labor availability. And many firms have said that they found it very useful for educating owners about that situation. So thank you for having me back.
Stay there. Oh, no
Okay.
problem. Our pleasure, Ken. So what we'll do for the folks that are virtual, what we'll do is we'll get to the folks here first, and then you can ask a question in the Q&A and we'll pull it up. But then what I'd ask you to do, once the question is asked, to repeat it for the folks that are on virtual so that they understand. They may not be able to hear it completely.
Right.
So any questions for Ken?
Ken, Jeff Leading here. Ken, you said you could send the slide deck to us. Would you be okay with us posting it on our website?
Absolutely, yes. Anything that I send out, you're welcome to use, distribute, cite, quote, just attribution to AGC of America, please.
Thank you.
Don't forget to repeat the question.
I listened to the PCA's recent economic forecast eds, and he's saying similar to you that he doesn't see a recession coming, but obviously when you go into the business websites and listen to the talking heads on TV, they're screaming and yelling that a recession's coming. Can you expand a little bit on why you say you don't think a recession is coming?
Yeah, the question was, would I expand on why I don't think a recession is coming? And the Portland Cement Association's most recent forecast agrees with that. Ed Sullivan, their chief economist, and I are both members of our professional organization, the National Association for Business Economics. I'm a past president and a fellow there. We had our annual meeting in Chicago earlier this week. And I also serve as a spokesperson for their surveys. On Monday morning, they released a quarterly survey of this time 45 economic forecasters. And while they had quite a gloomy tone, it was not a doomy tone. That is, they do think that the risks are to the downside overwhelmingly, but they also are not forecasting a downturn in real gross domestic product. That's econo-speak for inflation-adjusted spending on all kinds of activities and services in the U.S. net of imports. They don't think that that's going to be declining in any single quarter through the end of the forecast period, the end of 2023. So even though there's, now let me say that GDP is not actually the measure of recession. There is no statutory measure. Instead, there's a committee of the National Bureau of Economic Research, a nonprofit academic institution, that this committee takes its time in deciding when a recession started, when it ended, because they look at a wide range of factors, and some of that data comes in more slowly, some of it gets revised, but at the moment things are holding up well. And indeed, these forecasters think that we will continue to see a rise in employment every quarter, not as strong as we've had over the last couple of years, which has been at some of the fastest growth rate of employment in 40 some years. And given the slowdown in the population growth, particularly the working age population, as we've had a huge drop in immigrants and more people retiring than coming into the workforce. Unfortunately, a huge increase in excess deaths from COVID, from diseases that weren't treated on a timely basis during COVID, and also from suicides and unplanned deaths of people using opioids and other substances. All of those things mean that we should be expecting much slower growth of jobs, but nevertheless a positive figure. So I share those views that we have enough things going for us in terms of, as I said earlier, growing incomes, lots of spending power at the individual, the household and business level, but also government at all levels will be putting a lot more into investment and purchases. All of those things, I think, will keep the economy growing. I admit the risk is still quite strong. The fact that inflation is so remaining so high means that the Fed will continue to press hard on raising interest rates, and that will squeeze out more and more businesses, cause more rotation in the economy away from things that get financed or paid for by borrowing. But nevertheless, there's still going to be a lot growing.
Any other questions from the group here? All right, let's see what we have online here, if there's any questions. And we're getting to the folks here virtually. I'm going to go ahead and stop the share here and see if there's any questions from, there are no open questions. Okay, I'm going to give you one more chance, folks that are in virtual land, on whether or not you'd like to ask a question. I'll give you about 30 seconds. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Yep, we got a question from Dan.
So I have a question. When I was looking at watching the one slide where you talked about growth in different sectors and what that's looking like year over year, I was a little surprised at the water, wastewater, and sewer, considering that infrastructure in the country is 75 to 100 years old. That it was at the bottom of the list. It was actually showing a reduction of 23-25%. I'm curious as to your, with the other studies and the other information you see, did that make sense to you, or is that just the focus of where money being spent?
Right. The sewer and water are relatively small categories compared to all those others. So that's why it was at the bottom of the list. For the most part, ever since the pandemic hit, those have been high growth categories compared to just a few years ago. And certainly the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act boosts the state revolving funds for both drinking water and wastewater. And I think, as you say, we have a lot of very old water and sewer systems, particularly in the East and the Midwest, but many others are running into problems with the contaminants in the water that are going to require huge upgrades. So I think that these categories have very strong potential for growth over the next few years.
Anything else? Well, Ken, we're very grateful. Thank you very, very much for joining us. And folks, have a great day. Have a great morning.